We have to get away from trying to create or to change our learners to fit our system. I think that is the most important thing. We have to get to a point where we're creating our classrooms based on what our learners need. And that means I cannot answer this question because it depends so much on the individual makeup of your classroom and of the individual students.
You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week on Speaking of Language,
Sara Lee closes out our season discussing strategies for supporting neurodiverse language learners and how these design principles create better learning outcomes for the entire classroom.
Welcome to a new episode of Speaking of Language. I'm Angelica Kramer, the director of the Language Resource Center at Cornell University.
And I'm Sam Lupowitz, the LRC's media manager. We are excited to continue our conversation with Sara Lee today. She's our most recent Speaker Series event guest.
Sara shared with us her insights on neurodivergent language learners and how we can tailor our teaching strategies to best support all learners. You can watch her full presentation on our website.
Welcome to Speaking of Language, Sara.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
We are really excited to continue talking about the most wonderful presentation that you gave at Cornell. This is actually your second time joining us on our podcast, so please remind our listeners who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I am an associate teaching professor at Arizona State University, and I am teaching a lot of German classes. I am from Germany, grew up there, went to school there, and then when I came over here, I started working at Arizona State University about 15 years ago, and my research interest is how do people learn a second language or a third language when they're neurodiverse. So especially when it comes to dyslexia, how does dyslexia impact language learning, and how can we make our language classroom more accessible to help learners with dyslexia and neurodiverse learners overall?
And you are too humble because you were also the 2024 Southwest Conference on Language Teaching Teacher of the Year. And you were also a finalist for the 2025 ACTFL National Language Teacher of the Year. So shout out right there.
That also happened, yeah. Side note.
Indeed, so it did.
Excellent. Well, to help us set the stage for everything you talked about in your presentation, please briefly review what neurodiversity is and what it can look like in our classrooms.
So neurodiversity is such a big term, right? Because I was talking a lot about executive functions because in a way, everything comes back to executive functions. Executive functions are the functions that we have or that every person has when they are learning. It's the basic functions like inhibition or organization or, structuring or working memory. And so neurodiversity is if some of these executive functions are not developed as strongly as the others, and that has an impact on learning and how we're learning. And so one of the better known ones is when it comes to focus and attention. So a lot of people with ADHD are struggling to focus on something for a longer amount of time or direct their attention, and that can result in our classroom in learners who are highly motivated to learn the language, but who are struggling to really regulate their focus, and therefore who are then struggling to learn the language in a way that we would usually expect learners to learn a language.
You just mentioned the executive functions and their impact, depending on what kind of a neurodiversity students might bring with them. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference between ADHD and autism? You reviewed that as part of your presentation. So how are the executive functions impacted differently in students who have ADHD versus autism?
I will absolutely do that. But what I have to say, first of all, is in an ideal world, we could really separate one neurodiversity from the other. We could
Right.
say, okay, this is 100% ADHD
Mm-hmm.
or 100% autism. But there are a lot of ways in which we have pretty much where a learner presents a certain way and it falls into both categories. We have a lot of comorbidities. So comorbidities is where you are not neurotypical, but it could be, that you have ADHD, but you also have autism. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's really affecting each other. So it's very hard, even though I may talk about it as if you can really separate
Right.
those two, it is really hard to separate where there's the clear line. So ADHD is a lot that I already talked about, the focus. So how can I focus on something? How can I
Mm-hmm.
direct my focus to learn? And autism is in most cases, and there are different forms of autism. More generally speaking, when there are problems with the social interactions.
Mm-hmm.
So in the way of how do I interact with someone else? How do I read someone else's nonverbal communication, but also the verbal communication? However, and this is really important to say for both for ADHD and for autism, they are both spectrum disabilities. So that
Right.
means they can be very, like you can be very strongly affected by this disability, or you could also be less affected by this disability. And so it is hard, again, to tell where
Mm-hmm.
really to draw the line between those disabilities. Also, and this needs to be said when we look at autism, we have different forms of autism. So it is
Sure.
the very early childhood autism, and this would also impact, for example, the ability of people to speak at all or to communicate. So there are nonverbal people with autism, but those are usually not the ones that we see in our classrooms.
Sure.
And then there are forms of autism like Asperger's, for example, where there is an average or clearly above average intelligence. And so there are some forms of language processing that are very, 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 very highly developed, and then other areas that are less developed. So
Mm-hmm.
there are all these different aspects of autism and ADHD. There's not the one kind.
Sure.
Hmm.
What does the ideal classroom environment for students look like then, considering students with ADHD and those with autism have different needs, for example? How can we best support all of our learners, regardless of official diagnoses for specific accommodations?
That's a great question. So the most important thing is we have to get away from trying to create or to change our learners to fit our system. I think
Mm.
that is the most important thing. We have to get to a point where we are creating our classrooms based on what our learners need. And that means I cannot answer this question because it depends so much on the individual makeup of your
Hmm.
classroom and of the individual student. So, if I can dream in my perfect world, in my ideal world, what I would like to see in our educational system is that we as teachers all have the experience and knowledge to see our learners and to assess what they need and what their individual, not just where they are lacking, but also what their strengths are, and to say, okay, this is exactly what this student needs to be successful in my classroom, and therefore I will put together an individualized learning plan that will help this learner. So that would be the ideal. But there are certainly things that we can absolutely do to help learners in our classroom in general. And that would be to have this whole wide, like the variety of teaching methods that we can implement basing on what our students need. So I'm a big
Mm-hmm.
fan of cooperative learning methods,
Mm-hmm.
which is really amazing for students who are struggling with executive functions of focus, for example, because it gets them up, it gets them to communicate with others, to work with others, which at the same time can be really challenging for learners with autism. So then at the same time, we need to find ways of how can we build a classroom environment to help autistic learners. And that would be anything that is very, very structured. So what we do as teachers anyways is we have a really good plan knowing what's going to happen in the class. So in a flipped classroom environment, for example, we need to make sure that we provide the learners already beforehand with a really structured outline of what we're doing. So your listeners may say, okay, this is great theory, but you're saying on the one hand, we're doing a lot of cooperative learning methods. On the other hand, we have learners who are struggling with the social part of cooperative learning, right? So in the end, what's really, really helpful and what's our ideal is to use a lot of universal design in our classrooms so that we are saying, okay, what is our objective in our teaching and how can we use universal design to create activities to have just different ways that all lead to the same goal, and the goal is our learning objective, so that we are really helping every student being successful in our classroom.
You also talked about working with your students, so cooperative, not only learning, but cooperative, like almost course design, right? So thinking about rubrics, for example, can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So for me, and I think this has nothing to do so much with the neurodiverse learners, but I love to make students responsible for their own learning and take responsibility for their own learning. It doesn't matter which age those learners are.
Sure.
And that is, for example, that we create rubrics together. So since we are testing what we are teaching, what helps is that we're asking our students, so based on everything that we've done in our classroom, what would you test, how would you test, and how would you grade? What do you think would be fair grading? So I sit down with my students and we are determining together where we have started in the unit, what were the outcomes that we were trying to achieve, what did we achieve, and how can we test that? And then and then I give them examples of what the test is going to look like. And then we're working together on what does a rubric look like? So, for example, my students are sitting together in groups and they're trying to decide, let's say, if we have a writing assignment, what would be fair grading? How much should be, the weight of grammar or of vocabulary or of spelling? And what was our focus in this unit? So how many points should there be for content? And then I let the students discuss what would be fair grading and what's really representing what we've learned and what our outcomes are. And it is really fascinating how students, first of all, from a teacher perspective, which is really great, students don't complain about grades anymore because they put together their rubric. So, who am I? I'm just executing what they told me to do, which is really amazing. But the other thing is also that they understand better what the expectations are. And this is really the best preparation for the assessment that we're having because they're putting it together. And it's absolute transparency. And I think this transparency is something that learners always appreciate. However, I have to say this sounds amazing because it is amazing, but it does take a lot of time. So when you're doing your lesson plan, or your unit plan, make sure to keep that in mind, how long it takes to work on this rubric.
Well, and this is actually, so you had presented this example of rubrics developed together with your students as solutions for everyone, right? Regardless of a diagnosis or regardless of a learning difference or anything like that.
Right.
You also presented a bunch of other solutions like visualizing activity steps and goals, contextualizing new vocabulary and connecting that to prior knowledge, or even differentiating culture activities. And you just mentioned that all of this takes time. So how do you balance that? What is your suggestion for somebody who is thinking about how to, speak to all the different students in their classroom? What is feasible when you first start out?
Feasible is the very first step. It's I invite everyone who wasn't at the presentation, to maybe watch the presentation and look at the examples that I give of what you can do. Like, I give for dyslexia, I give the little example of let your students take a quick picture with your phone, instead of having them write down everything that you wrote onto the whiteboard, because that saves time and is especially for dyslexic students so important that they can actually that they don't have to write everything down. So if you implement this first little step and you do that and you repeat it so often every time that it just becomes like second nature to you, and it's just part of your teaching personality, then it's going to be, you don't even think about it anymore. And so implementing another step, one step at a time, is really, really helpful. So to come back to the example with the rubrics, instead of doing that for your whatever your final essay or paper is or whatever, start with maybe a vocabulary quiz. Start with something really small, like a small assessment, to just try it out and see how your class reacts to it. And then it's definitely what's happening is when you introduce it at the beginning of the semester and you go throughout the semester, the students know exactly what you want, and the process gets a lot quicker because they're getting used to this. But do know, though, that what can happen is that they're going to ask your colleagues, and next time, in another class, they're going to be like, oh, this is really cool. Can we do this in this class as well? So you may have to explain yourself to your colleagues.
Oh,
Fantastic. Well, since you mentioned dyslexia, you are also a certified dyslexia therapist, and are currently developing an error analysis and intervention to increase spelling proficiency for learners of German. So first off, how is the process of learning to read and write different in your first language compared to an additional language?
Oh, where should I start? How much time do we have?
unlimited.
So how is it different? So there is, of course, the biggest difference is when you start learning how to read and write in your first language, you already know all the words and you know all the meaning of the words, right? So you pretty much have this knowledge, and you just have to figure out how to put it into writing or how to start the reading process. However, when you start, usually when you're not bilingual, or when you don't start it at the same time with your second or third language, you don't know the words, you don't know the meaning, you have a very limited vocabulary, but you already have experience in how to read and how to write. And so therefore it's a different way of how you approach reading and writing, because you expect that you already know how to read and write, but now you just have to know how to pronounce it differently for the new words and how to spell it differently for the new words. So that is the expectation. So the expectation is it should be really easy because it's just a small change and I already know how to read and write. But then you realize, oh, wait, there's a ton of different sounds, and
Right.
maybe even like in German, you have different letters, and that makes it a lot harder. And what's really interesting, and I invite your listeners to think about their own language here, is to take German, for example. We have a pretty clear so-called phoneme-grapheme correspondence, so the sound to letter, what sounds we hear and what letters we have to write. And then there are languages where you hear just one sound and you suddenly have, a lot of letters that need to be written. And those are much harder to learn how to write because you have to kind of grasp the linguistic concept that is underlying this language.
What does it look like if you have different writing systems in your first language versus an additional language? I mean, that must add yet another layer of complexity, right?
Oh, 100. Yes and no. 100%. It is a different layer of complexity, but this is what's so difficult when it comes to dyslexia in second language acquisition, that there is not the solution for dyslexia in second language acquisition, because it depends on what is your first language and what is your second language. So what is the linguistic knowledge that you bring from your first language, and how does it translate to your second language? it translate to your second language? Is the
Right.
second language more or less complex? And what is pretty much the knowledge that you already bring? So as you can see, this is really complex because it depends on the individual makeup of first language, second language, or third language. And then, of course, it also depends on, like you just said, if I have a different writing system, it can be an advantage that it is completely different. So, but it could
Interesting.
also be a disadvantage because I don't yet have the experience with this writing system. So it can be a lot more challenging. So dyslexia looks very different. To give you an example, I just mentioned that in German we have a relatively clear phoneme-grapheme correspondence. So usually learners of English whose L1 is English, they usually experience that German is a lot easier when it comes to spelling because it's so much clearer in the correspondence of letters and sounds than it is in English. The other way around, when you have German, when you're an L1 speaker of German and you learn English, you're struggling a lot more because, like, wow, where do all these letters come from? And how can I have one sound and so many different
Yeah.
letters?
Yep.
I'm just reminding everyone of there, right? And you suddenly wonder how can I make sense of this? So the combination of L1 and L2 has a huge impact of how you experience a language.
Terrific. So I'm going to follow up now on my initial question
Mhm.
about developing the error analysis. What does your error analysis focus on, and how does it help the learner?
Yeah, exactly. How does it help? Because the error analysis itself doesn't give us anything if it doesn't help the learner, right? So the error analysis is a linguistic analysis where I developed three different categories: the phoneme-grapheme correspondence, which is usually the first level of how we are learning the language, which is the letter and sound combination. And then the next step is the mental-graphemic representation. That's the second category. And those are spelling errors that are specific, that you pretty much, in simple terms, that you can't really hear, but that are specific spelling rules that are unique to the language. So, for example, we have an H in German that you cannot hear, but that is pretty much entered into the word, and it makes the word long, so to say, or the stressed syllable is long. And so those are mental graphemic representation errors. And then we have typical errors, that's the third category, that are an interference between German and English. So where pretty much the English speakers are using the English language knowledge that they have, and they're transferring it to the L2 to German. So what I do is I have all these, the three big categories and the subcategories. I have the written text in front of me, and I'm going through every spelling error and I'm determining what is the cause for this error. So I'm looking exactly what caused this error, with what kind of ability is not yet fully developed. And then based on that, I can look at the error analysis and can say, okay, this learner has in this area a bunch of errors. So this is an area that still needs to be developed further. However, this learner also, and I love this about the error analysis, I can tell exactly which areas are already developed very well and that are very strong. So I can give the learner the feedback, hey, I know exactly what we need to be working on with you, but I can also tell you this is amazing. This is your strength. This is what you're really good at. And this kind of positive feedback is really important, especially since, I don't know your experiences, but when I went to school, I heard a lot of 18 errors, bad spelling or something like that. And it was all about how many errors. It was just counting the errors. And this way we can also count or point out the strength that the individual learner has. So what I do in my classroom is I do the error analysis for my students at the beginning of the semester, and I can then determine individual areas that my students are working on. So they get individual topics that they're going to be working on either for the unit or for the whole semester, and I can determine also what my class as a whole needs. So it could be that with one class, I'm focusing on capitalization errors, but with another class, I'm focusing on this elongation age that's stressing or where the stress syllable is long, because that's where they have most of their errors. So it's a very individualized error analysis that helps the student develop the areas that they individually still struggle with.
How can one find time to do that when they teach multiple sections, multiple classes with however many students? Like, I think this is amazing work and it is so useful for the students, but how do you remain sane?
You don't. No, I'm just kidding. No.
How do any of us really?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well.
That is, and I know that probably a lot of your listeners right now were exactly thinking what you just expressed. So I thank you for asking that question. Yes, how can we do that? So my suggestion is to not do that with all the students for all of your classes, but again, start really small. Start with maybe your smallest class that you have, do the error analysis just once to kind of get used to doing the error analysis. And if you continue doing this, what's going to happen is that you don't have to actually sit down with the error analysis sheet and actually write down and mark down all the errors. But what's going to happen is you're going to read a text completely different. You're going to be reading your text and the student's text, and you're going to be like, oh, I can already see there are more errors in, I don't know, phoneme, grapheme, the vocalized R, or whatever area it is, because you are focusing or you are thinking in these different categories. So by now, when I do this, I don't do the itty bitty every single error noting it down, but I'm reading it and I take notes because I see it already, and then I can say, okay, this is your individual error analysis, and give this feedback. So it just takes practice, and it's going to get a lot easier with time, and you're going to get a lot faster with time. But just don't try to implement it for all of your students right away, but give yourself the grace and time to just implement it from maybe one student or one class, and then with time doing it for more classes.
So at what level do you do this? Do you do this in your first semester of a language class, or do you suggest that this would be more beneficial at a later point in a student's language proficiency journey?
I do it for all of my classes just because it doesn't take me a lot of time anymore to do it. You can do it at every single level. The purpose is differently. So, for example, in my first year class, I would do it for example, to see, do I still need to work a lot more on pronunciation? Because there, of course, in order to differentiate sounds, you have to be able to process these sounds, and it's also closely connected to the pronunciation and how you pronounce those different sounds that are new to you. So in a German 101 class, I would use that a lot or the focus would be a little different. However, whereas in comparison in our 300 or 400 level class with our minors and majors, I would do it differently, where I would really go into the linguistics of it and work on what is the stress syllable, what are the spelling rules, how can we apply the spelling rules, which I wouldn't do in German 101. So as always, think about your objective and think about how the error analysis is really helping your objective and helping you reach your objective.
And I think one thing that's probably important to maybe mention again and stress here is that just like with all these strategies for all students that you mentioned earlier with the executive functions and things like that, and the error analysis, this does not mean that all your students have a learning difference, right? I mean, you do the error analysis, even though it might come out of your work in dyslexia. This has not necessarily anything to do with the fact that students are dyslexic.
Oh, 100%. Yes, absolutely. Because, and I cannot stress this often enough, we are not here to make a diagnosis. We are not here to tell our students, this is not our job. Even if I have a really strong suspicion, I would never, ever, ever say, hey, is there a possibility that you have dyslexia, for example. Never ever would I say that, because it's
Sure.
not my place. It is not
Yeah.
my place to do that. It's not my job to do that. And because if you think of this whole range of, we talked about that autism, ADHD is a spectrum. Where does the spectrum start? That's so
Sure.
arbitrary that someone said,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this is now when we call it ADHD or autism. And
Right.
so therefore, our job as educators is that we're looking at what are our individual students' needs, what are their strengths, and how can we help them? And so that's why this error analysis is absolutely not just for learners with dyslexia, but it is really for everyone and to help everyone.
Well, so to jump off of that, uh, what are some other thoughts you have on accommodating students who may think they have a learning difference but no official diagnosis?
hmm Um, you know, I how do I start? How do I start this? So we have a lot of different students and how students approach any form of disabilities. I have students who are, we have students who are coming to us and who say, hey, I have these disabilities, I'm struggling
Mm,
with this. And then we have students who have a diagnosis who would never share that with us, because especially at, the college university level, the challenge is that they feel like, okay, this is not appropriate anymore. I
Sure.
shouldn't have this. This is, I'm embarrassed, or I don't want to be special anymore. I don't want
aw.
any special treatment anymore. So I actually almost never talk about diagnoses, or that I say, hey, share this with me or not, because I really don't. Not that I don't care, but I don't
Right.
care.
Mm-hmm.
It's not
Yep.
important for me. It's not important for my work. So what I do is that I say, at the beginning of every class, I say to my students, if you know a way of how you are learning well, and if you have an experience, because at our level at the university, we already get students who have been in school for, 12 years plus, and so they already know what works for them or what doesn't work for them. So I say, if you know a way of how language learning works for you, then let me know. If you have no idea how it works for you, then come to me, and we're going to go through all the different ways of how language learning could work. So are you more the visual learner? Are you more the auditory learner? Are you learning better in with a partner or in a group or by yourself? Are you more of a creative learner? Is like, if the objective is to for universal design, if the objective is that I want to see if a learner can go into a supermarket and purchase some products, um, maybe one student wants to do a video actually going into a store and narrating what they do in German. And maybe I have another student who says, I feel better about writing a dialogue and being by myself
Right.
doing this. But in the end, they all reach the same objective. And so I can see how my learner learns ideally and how I can support them. Again, making my classroom fit my learners' needs instead of making my learners, fit into my classroom.
Yeah.
Nice.
hmm
So, Sarah, if our listeners are interested in learning more about all these topics and maybe even finding suggestions for their own teaching, where should they look?
Oh, there are so many different places. I mean, of course, there's a lot of literature out there, and I'm happy to share the literature list with like applied, uh, you know, with more of an applied focus on what we can
Mm.
do in the classroom. So I'm happy to share that with you. And other than that, actually, my real life best advice is talk to your colleagues, because there is so much experience around us with our colleagues to say, hey, I have this learner that I'm wondering how to support them. And have you been in this situation? And what have you done? And then reaching out to these other wonderful educators and say what has helped. So definitely the common literature and the articles that are out there when it comes to applied learning, when it comes to looking at the different books, but also take full advantage of the knowledge and experience of your fellow educators.
Fantastic. And any other projects you're working on that you'd like to share?
I'm pretty busy with the error analysis and developing that further. So what I'm doing right now is that I'm looking in general of how the error analysis is, like the intervention is really impacting, like what the impact is of an intervention based on the error analysis. My next steps that I want to see is if there are, when it comes to different learners, so learners with dyslexia, for example, how an intervention is impacting that based on the error analysis. And then the next big step that I want to do, because Arizona State has a very large online program, so I really want to see how this can be translated into the online learning environment, and how spelling ability, spelling and reading is developed differently with online learners, and how we can support our online learners.
Sara, this work is so fascinating, and I think this is so important, especially if we think about the current generation of students and the differences that they bring to the classroom.
Absolutely.
So we could keep chatting forever, but before we sign off, we'd like to ask you for a word in a language that you love, that you are learning, that you want to learn, that makes you feel good. What is that word?
Okay, so the word that makes me feel good, and it needs a little bit of explanation. It is of course a German word, because
Sehr schön.
let's face it, German is the most beautiful language.
Indeed.
So
Agreed.
that's just what it is. And the word is, and a lot of Germans may not know this word, is Scheidebecher. So Scheidebecher, yeah, I can tell you've
Yeah, I
never
don't know
heard
that.
word. Yeah. So my dad always says, he uses this word all the time. It's pretty much a departure cup. It's when you've been sitting together, you've been having a good time, you've been, at the party drinking. And so before you go home, you're going to have a Scheidebecher, you're going to have the departure cup. It's the last drink you're going to share together, just because it has been a wonderful, great evening. And so that always carries a super special meaning of, like, just wrapping up a wonderful evening is, kommen wir, trinken noch einen Scheidebecher.
Sehr schön.
Yeah.
Well, what a lovely way to wrap up this podcast. Thank you.
I wish I could share a Scheidebecher with you, but
Yeah, indeed.
Something for next time. And until then, thank you so much for speaking of language with us, Sara.
Thank you for having me.
Dear listeners, speaking of Scheidebecher, that's a wrap for season 15.
Woo.
We will be back in September with new topics and guests.
In the meantime, you can listen to our archived shows on our website at lrc.cornell.edu or wherever you listen to podcasts. Have a happy summer, and do tune back in this fall. Until then,
Auf Wiederhören!
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu.
and follow Cornell LRC on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky.
Speaking of Language is produced by Angelika Kramer and Sam Lupowitz.
Recorded by Sam Lupowitz.
Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.
Thanks also to the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell University.
As a reminder, the ideas and opinions expressed on this podcast do not reflect those of the College of Arts and Sciences or any other official entity of Cornell University.
We thank our listeners, and do stay tuned for our next episode.